They say that blood is the strongest bond, a sacred thread that connects a family through generations. But what they fail to mention is that when that same thread is used by your own kin to create a noose, it leaves the deepest, most unforgiving mark upon the soul. Inside the mahogany-paneled walls of Mr. Abernathy's law office, high above the bustling streets of Boston, the air was thick enough to choke on. It was a silence, filled with the weight of unspoken words, and the chilling finality of a decision already made. Liam O'Connell, at 35 years old, sat perfectly still, his posture a stark contrast to the storm brewing within him. Across the polished expanse of the table sat his family. His father, Richard, the self-made titan of construction, whose face was a mask of stern disappointment. His mother, Eleanor, who avoided his gaze, her attention fixed on a meaningless spot on the Persian rug. And next to them, his twin brother, Ethan, the golden child, who wore an expression of feigned solemnity that barely concealed the triumphant smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Mr. Abernathy, a man who had known the family for decades, cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the vacuum of the room. He adjusted his glasses and read the final, critical clause from the document before him, the final amendment to the O'Connell Family Trust. His voice was monotone, a sterile delivery system for a poison meant for Liam. And as such, all assets, properties, and controlling interests of O'Connell and Sons, including all subsidiary holdings and personal estates, shall be transferred to the sole management and benefit of my son, Ethan O'Connell. The lawyer paused, letting the words hang in the air like a death sentence. He scanned the document one last time before closing the leather-bound folder with a soft, definitive thud. The sound echoed in Liam's ears, the closing of a door to a life he had helped build. He had expected a reduced share, a lecture embedded in legal jargon, a punishment for a crime he never committed. He had not expected erasure. His name was not mentioned once, not for a single dollar, not for a sentimental keepsake. It was as if he had ceased to exist. He didn't shout, he didn't beg. A strange and terrifying calm washed over him, hollowing him out, leaving behind nothing but cold, sharp clarity. He looked at his parents, truly looked at them, and saw not a mother and father, but strangers who had passed judgment without a trial. He saw his brother, who had been both judge and jury. In their faces, he found no remorse, no sadness, only the cold, hard glint of justification. And in that moment, the son in him died, and something else, something far more patient and precise, began to take root in the ruins. The storm had found its eye. To understand the depth of the wound inflicted in that sterile law office, one must first understand the architecture of the O'Connell family itself. It was a structure built by one man's ambition, adorned by another's charm, and held together by the silent, thankless work of the third. The patriarch, Richard O'Connell, was a legend forged in gravel and sweat. He was the son of Irish immigrants who arrived in Boston with nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn refusal to fail. Richard started with a single wheelbarrow and a set of second-hand tools, slowly, painstakingly, building a construction empire that would eventually etch its name into the city's skyline. He was a man of concrete and steel, who believed that a person's worth could be measured by the legacy they built. He loved his sons. Of this there was no doubt. But he loved the company, O'Connell and Sons, with a fierce, possessive passion that often blurred the lines between fatherhood and ownership. From the very beginning, his twin sons were like two sides of a freshly minted coin, identical in appearance, yet destined for different hands. Liam was the quiet one, the observer. While other children played with toys, Liam built intricate structures out of scrap wood and discarded nails in the back of his father's workshop. He didn't just see buildings. He saw the geometry, the stress points, the elegant dance of physics that kept them standing. He inherited his father's work ethic, but none of his bluster. His satisfaction came not from applause, but from the quiet hum of a perfectly balanced design, the clean lines of a blueprint that solved an impossible problem. He was the company's anchor. By the time he was 30, Liam was the chief architect and head of engineering, the true engine of O'Connell and Sons. It was Liam's innovative designs that won them the lucrative contracts. It was Liam's meticulous planning that brought projects in under budget and ahead of schedule. It was Liam who would be on site at 3 a.m. during a critical concrete pour, ensuring every detail was flawless, his face illuminated by the harsh work lights, a silent guardian of his father's legacy. He never asked for credit, assuming, naively, that his work would speak for itself. His father's approval was all he sought, and it was given sparingly, often in the form of a gruff nod or a simple, "good work." For Liam, that was enough. Then there was Ethan. If Liam was the company's anchor, Ethan was its sail, catching every gust of wind and propelling them forward in the public eye. He was born with a silver tongue and an innate understanding of human desire. He could sell a dream to a cynic, charm a committee into submission, and remember the names of every client's spouse and children. He moved through the world of boardrooms and gala dinners with an effortless grace that his brother could never replicate. Ethan was the vice president of business development, the face of the company. He presented Liam's designs with such passion and conviction that people often assumed the ideas were his own, an illusion Ethan never bothered to correct. He was the one who brought home the signed contracts, the one whose smiling face appeared in trade magazines, the one who stood beside their father at press conferences. To the outside world, and increasingly to his own parents, Ethan was the visionary, the rainmaker, the worthy heir to the O'Connell throne. The dynamic was a slow-acting poison that had been seeping into the family's foundations for years. Their mother, Eleanor, played a significant role in this imbalance. She came from old Boston money and had never quite shed the belief that appearances were paramount. She found Liam's quiet intensity and dirt-under-the-fingernails approach to be somewhat common, a relic of his father's humble beginnings. But Ethan, with his tailored suits, his easy laughter, and his network of influential friends, was everything she understood success to be. She would beam with pride as Ethan recounted his latest social conquest while gently chiding Liam for not being more outgoing. She celebrated the deal, not the design that made the deal possible. The rivalry, if it could be called that, was entirely one-sided. Liam never saw his brother as a competitor. He believed they were a team, each contributing their unique strengths to a shared goal. He was proud of Ethan's ability to win people over, oblivious to the fact that Ethan's greatest conquest was the perception of their own parents. Ethan, however, was consumed by a quiet, gnawing envy. He knew, in a place he would never admit, that he was hollow. He was a magnificent facade on a building with no foundation. He could sell the skyscraper, but he couldn't design it, couldn't build it, and certainly couldn't save it if it started to crumble. Every award Liam won for architectural innovation, every hushed word of praise from a seasoned engineer about Liam's genius, was a chisel chipping away at his fragile ego. He needed to be not just the face, but the substance as well. And if he couldn't create the substance, he would simply have to own it and erase the man who could. This festering imbalance came to a head on their 30th birthday. Richard had gifted them both with significant shares in the company. Liam, ever the pragmatist, immediately reinvested his dividends back into the firm's research and development division, funding a new software that would streamline their entire design process. Ethan used his payout to buy a penthouse apartment and a flashy sports car, hosting lavish parties that served to expand his social influence. When Richard found out, he confronted both sons. He saw Liam's move as a quiet, sensible decision, but he saw Ethan's as an act of bold confidence, a demonstration of the O'Connell success. That night, at a large family dinner, Richard raised a glass to Ethan. To a son who isn't afraid to show the world what we're made of, he'd boomed, while the family applauded. He gave Liam a simple pat on the back later, saying, "Keep an eye on the numbers, boy. That's your strength." It was in that moment that the roles were irrevocably cast. Liam was the responsible, reliable, and ultimately invisible caretaker. Ethan was the brilliant, shining star. It was a perception built on a lifetime of small choices, subtle preferences, and unspoken biases. A perception that Ethan had cultivated with the patience of a master gardener, and which he was now ready to harvest, leaving his brother's roots to wither and die in the unforgiving shade of his shadow. The plan was not born from a single flash of inspiration, but rather, it was cultivated over years of resentment, a poisonous vine that grew in the shadow of his brother's quiet competence. Ethan had watched as Liam's latest masterpiece, the Hawthorne Tower, rose to dominate the Boston skyline. It was a marvel of engineering and design, a project that had cemented O'Connell and Sons as the premier construction firm in the Northeast. The tower was Liam's vision, his genius, but it was Ethan's name that echoed in the toast-filled banquet halls celebrating its completion. And yet, the praise felt hollow because the whispers in the industry were growing louder. Articles were being written, not just about the company, but about the brilliant, reclusive architect behind its success. A feature in Architectural Digest was in the works, threatening to drag Liam out of the shadows and into a spotlight Ethan considered exclusively his own. This was the catalyst, the final push he needed to turn his simmering jealousy into a concrete, devastating weapon. His strategy was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, designed not to paint Liam as a simple thief, but as something far worse in his father's eyes, a fool who had gambled with the family legacy and lost. The opportunity presented itself in a small, almost forgotten corner of the company's finances. A few months prior, Liam had championed a pilot project, a small-scale community center built using a revolutionary, eco-friendly concrete aggregate from a new German supplier. It was a passion project, fully documented and budgeted for, designed to test the material's viability for future, larger-scale builds. The project was a success, but it was minor, filed away with little fanfare. To Ethan, this was the perfect seed of deceit. He spent weeks in his office after hours, the glow of his monitor casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. He wasn't a financial wizard like the company's CFO, but he was meticulous and patient. He began by creating a ghost entity, a fictional investment firm he called Apex Innovations. He then meticulously forged a trail of digital breadcrumbs. He created email chains between Liam's work account and a dummy address for a supposed partner at Apex, using snippets of Liam's real-world technical jargon that he'd picked up over the years to make the correspondence seem authentic. He intercepted and duplicated invoices from the German supplier, expertly altering the figures, transforming a $50,000 expenditure into a $2 million initial investment. He created false wire transfer confirmations, routing them through a series of offshore accounts that led to a dead end. The masterstroke was the creation of a shadow ledger, a beautifully fabricated set of books that detailed Liam's secret project. It showed the initial $2 million investment, followed by a series of desperate, larger cash infusions, all disguised as payments to various subcontractors on other, legitimate projects. The narrative was clear and damning. Liam, jealous of Ethan's deal-making prowess, had tried to play the role of a high-risk investor. He had secretly siphoned millions of company dollars into a speculative venture, and when it inevitably collapsed, he had been trying to hide the catastrophic losses. With the evidence complete, all that remained was the performance. He chose his moment carefully. It was a Thursday night, rainy and grim. He knew his father would be in his home study, poring over quarterly reports. He entered without knocking, his face pale, his hand clutching a leather-bound folder, as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't speak at first, simply stood in the doorway, allowing the silence and his own manufactured distress to fill the room. Richard looked up from his desk, his brow furrowed with annoyance that quickly turned to concern. "What is it, Ethan? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan's voice was a choked whisper. "Dad, I think we have a problem. A big one. I didn't know who else to go to." He laid the folder on the massive oak desk, his hands trembling slightly, a gesture he had practiced in front of his bathroom mirror. "I was cross-referencing the quarterly statements with the project outflow reports. I found some discrepancies. At first, I thought it was just a bookkeeping error, but I kept digging." He let his father open the folder. Inside, neatly tabbed and organized, was the entire fabricated narrative. The emails, the inflated invoices, the shadow ledger. Richard's face, weathered and tough as the concrete he built his life on, slowly drained of color. He was a man who understood numbers. Numbers didn't lie, and these numbers were screaming betrayal. Ethan moved in for the final, emotional blow. "I think he was trying to do something big on his own," he said, his voice laced with false sympathy. "Maybe he was tired of just being the architect. Maybe he wanted to prove he could be a player like me." He got in over his head. "Dad." The whole thing collapsed, and it looks like he lost everything he put in. He's been trying to cover it up for months. We're looking at a $7 million hole in our finances. $7 million. To Richard O'Connell, that number was more than just money. It was 5 years of his life. In the early days, it was the risk he never took, the mistake he never made. It was a direct assault on the very foundation of his empire. The idea that his own son, the meticulous, reliable one, could be so reckless, so deceitful, struck him like a physical blow. At that moment, Eleanor walked in, drawn by the tense silence. She saw the look on her husband's face, and her son's feigned anguish, and her hand flew to her mouth. Ethan didn't have to repeat the entire story. He simply looked at his mother, his eyes welling with crocodile tears, and said, "Liam has put us all at risk, Mom. He's been lying to us." For Eleanor, the financial loss was secondary to the social implications. A scandal, the shame, the perfect family portrait she had so carefully curated, shattered into a million pieces. Her hurt and disappointment instantly hardened into a cold, protective fury. Her son, her brilliant, charming Ethan, had been the one to uncover this mess. He was the hero, the protector. Liam was the source of this impending shame. Richard's grief quickly turned to a white-hot rage, the rage of a king betrayed by his most trusted general. He didn't question the evidence. He didn't consider the source. He saw only the numbers on the page and the pained expression on his favored son's face. The seeds of deceit, planted in the fertile ground of years of subtle favoritism and hidden insecurities, had taken root. And as the storm raged in that study, the verdict was passed, the sentence decided, long before the accused even knew he was on trial. The summons came not as a phone call, but as a sterile, formal email from his father's personal assistant, requesting his presence at the family estate for an urgent meeting. There was no warmth, no hope you're well, just a time and a date. Liam walked through the heavy oak doors of the house he grew up in, a place where the scent of lemon polish and old money always lingered in the air, and felt an immediate, unnerving chill. The confrontation took place in the library, a room that had always been his father's sanctuary. But this was not a sanctuary now, it was an interrogation room. His father sat behind his massive desk, the forged folder laid out before him like a piece of irrefutable scripture. His mother stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of glacial disappointment. Ethan was there too, of course, leaning against a bookshelf, positioning himself as a sorrowful observer to a tragedy he had authored. Liam entered with a mind full of engineering problems and project deadlines, completely unprepared for the ambush. He listened in stunned silence as his father, his voice trembling with a rage that Liam had not heard since a near-fatal crane accident years ago, laid out the accusations. He spoke of betrayal, of recklessness, of a staggering $7 million loss that threatened the stability of the company. Liam's initial shock quickly gave way to a surge of analytical clarity. His mind, trained to see flaws in blueprints and weaknesses in structures, immediately began to deconstruct the lie. He looked at the documents his father shoved across the desk. The numbers were wrong, the timelines were illogical, the very premise was absurd. He saw the forgery, not with the eyes of a criminalist, but with the innate understanding of an architect who knew the building from its foundation up. "This isn't right," Liam said, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the emotional tempest in the room. The German aggregate project had a budget of $50,000, fully approved. The funds were allocated from the R&D budget. I can show you the purchase orders, the real invoices, the final report. He tried to explain the logic, to walk his father through the actual, documented process. He spoke not with desperation, but with the quiet confidence of a man who trusts in facts. But he quickly realized he was not in a boardroom debating logistics. He was in a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. His logic was met with a wall of impenetrable emotion. Every fact he presented was interpreted as a more intricate lie. Every piece of evidence he offered to produce was dismissed as a further attempt at a cover-up. "Stop it, Liam," his mother's voice cut through the air, sharp and brittle. "Stop insulting our intelligence with these stories. Your brother is heartbroken that he had to uncover this. How could you do this to him? To your father?" It was that statement that finally broke through his analytical calm. How could you do this to him? The lie was so complete, so absolute, that Ethan had been repositioned as the victim. Liam looked at his brother, who met his gaze with a flicker of feigned sadness, a masterful performance of a man torn apart by his brother's failings. His father, the pragmatist, the man of numbers, slammed his hand on the desk. "I don't want to see your fabricated reports. I see what's in front of me. You gambled with this family's name, with my life's work, and you lost. You are no longer a part of this company. You are no longer a part of this family until you can repay what you have stolen." The words were a wrecking ball, demolishing the entire structure of Liam's world. It wasn't the loss of the money or the job that hollowed him out. It was the complete and utter annihilation of trust. It was the realization that his entire life of quiet dedication, of substantive work, meant nothing. It could all be undone by a whisper, by a well-told lie from a more favored son. He didn't argue further. He saw the futility in it. He was trying to use a slide rule to measure a ghost. He simply nodded, a single, sharp movement, and walked out of the library, out of the house, and out of the life he had known. The exile was swift and brutal. The next morning, an official termination notice was delivered by courier. His access to company servers and emails was revoked. His corporate credit cards were canceled. A check for his final salary was included, a pittance that felt more like an insult than a payment. He was informed that his shares in the company, held within the family trust, were now frozen. When he went to his office to collect his personal belongings, a security guard he'd known for 10 years had to escort him, his face a mixture of pity and embarrassment. Colleagues he had mentored and worked with for over a decade averted their eyes, whispering behind their hands. The humiliation was a thick, suffocating coat he was forced to wear. He drove home to the house he shared with his wife, Sarah, a place that suddenly felt like a temporary refuge on borrowed time. She found him in their living room, standing by the window, staring out at nothing. He didn't have to say a word. She saw the devastation in the rigid set of his shoulders. He finally told her everything, the words coming out in a flat, emotionless tone, as if he were describing the structural failure of a distant, anonymous building. Sarah, a nurse accustomed to seeing people at their most broken, listened without interruption. When he finished, she didn't offer platitudes or false hope. She simply wrapped her arms around him and said the only thing that mattered: "I believe you." In that moment, her unwavering faith was the last remaining pillar in his collapsed world. With his income gone and their assets frozen, they couldn't afford their mortgage. Within a month, they had sold the house and most of their possessions, moving into a small, 2-bedroom apartment in a less fashionable part of the city. The sound of sirens replaced the quiet hum of their suburban street. The view was of a brick wall instead of a manicured lawn. They unpacked boxes filled with the fragments of their old life, a life that now felt like a distant dream. During this time, Liam changed. The hurt was too vast, the betrayal too fundamental. It began to cool and harden within him, turning from a molten wound into something solid and sharp. He had tried to use reason. He had tried to use truth. Both had failed. So he chose a new tool: silence. He stopped calling his parents. He blocked Ethan's number. He did not respond to the letters from the family lawyers. His silence wasn't the absence of words. It was the presence of a profound and unshakable resolve. It was a space where the noise of their accusations faded and a new, colder, and far more precise voice could finally be heard. It was the voice of an architect staring at a pile of rubble, already sketching the blueprints for what he would build in its place. Months bled into one another, each one a small victory in the quiet war of survival. The ghost of Liam's former life faded, replaced by the sharp, tangible realities of their new existence. Their small apartment, which had initially felt like a cage, slowly became a home, filled with the scent of Sarah's cooking and the quiet scratching of Liam's pencil on drafting paper. Sarah was a force of unwavering strength, taking on extra shifts at the hospital. Her compassion for her patients, a stark contrast to the calculated cruelty they had endured. She never once complained, her belief in Liam, a silent, steady flame in the darkness. Liam, stripped of his title and family name, found a surprising sense of liberation. He took a position at a small, boutique architectural firm run by a man who valued talent over pedigree. He was no longer an O'Connell. He was just Liam, an architect. He poured himself into his work with a renewed focus, designing a community library, a low-income housing project, and a small but elegant pedestrian bridge. There was no glory, no nine-figure budgets, but there was a purity to it. It was the simple, satisfying act of creation, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was truly his own. He was beginning to build a new foundation, one far from the crumbling artifice of his family. He thought the final tie to that life had been severed. He was wrong. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was nestled amongst bills and junk mail, its thick, cream-colored cardstock and the elegant letterhead of Abernathy and Finch standing out like a relic from another era. Liam's first instinct was to burn it. Every communication from that world had been a blade, and he had no desire to offer himself up for another cut. "You should open it," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. "Don't let them make you afraid of your own mailbox, Liam. Whatever it is, we'll face it." With a sigh, he slit the envelope open. The language inside was dense, a thicket of legal jargon that was nearly impenetrable. It was a formal notification regarding the O'Connell family trust. It spoke of his parents' decision to enact the succession and distribution protocol as they were formally retiring. It was, in essence, an announcement that they were officially handing the keys to the kingdom to Ethan. Liam felt a familiar, bitter pang, but he kept reading, scanning the paragraphs for the inevitable demand or legal threat, and then he saw it, buried deep within the fourth page, a ghost from a past he had forgotten. It was a reference to the original, unamended trust document drafted over a decade ago. Pursuant to Article 4, Section 2 of the O'Connell Family Trust, as established on the 14th of August 2015, the fiduciary role of primary executor is assigned to, and legally binding upon, Liam Patrick O'Connell. He read the sentence again, and then a third time. It made no sense. They had erased him, written him out of existence. He was not a beneficiary. He was a pariah. How could he possibly hold a position of power? He handed the letter to Sarah, his finger pointing to the paragraph. She read it, her brow furrowed in concentration. Executor? What does that even mean? Liam's mind, the architect's mind, began to work. He started to see the shape of it, the underlying structure. The executor wasn't a beneficiary. The executor was the mechanic, the operator, the person legally responsible for carrying out the trust's instructions. He was the one who had to manage the assets, settle any debts, and, ultimately, ensure the inheritance was delivered to the rightful heir. The heir was Ethan, but the power to manage, control, and liquidate every single asset, that power, it seemed, was his. The oversight was so colossal, so stunningly arrogant, that it was almost beautiful in its simplicity. He could see exactly how it happened. A decade ago, when the trust was first created, he was the logical choice for executor. He was the meticulous one, the responsible one, the son Richard trusted with the nuts and bolts of the operation. Ethan was the heir apparent, but Liam was the designated caretaker. Then came the betrayal. In their blind rage and grief, his parents had stormed into their lawyer's office with a single emotional directive: cut Liam out. Give everything to Ethan. They had focused entirely on the outcome, on the distribution of wealth. They had ripped out the pages, naming him a beneficiary. But in their haste, they had forgotten about the engine room of the entire document. They had left the mechanic in place, never imagining he would be anything but a dormant, irrelevant cog. And now, by choosing this moment to retire and formally activate the transfer of power to Ethan, they had just handed that mechanic the keys and a full tank of gas. They had, in their own effort to crown their golden son, unknowingly placed a loaded gun into the hands of the man they had exiled. Liam stood up, and walked to the window, looking down at the street he now called home. The sirens, the traffic, the messy, vibrant life of the city. He had been living in a world of muted grays since the betrayal, a world of survival and quiet dignity. But now, a spark of color returned. It wasn't the warm glow of forgiveness, nor the bright flash of happiness. It was the cold, sharp, and intensely focused blue of a gas flame. He was not a son anymore. He was not a victim. He was the executor. And his family, in their infinite wisdom, had just given him a job to do. He would execute their will. He would execute it down to the last letter, with the cold, brutal precision of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The silent exile was over. The letter from Abernathy and Finch was not a key. It was the schematic for a key. Liam knew that to forge it properly, he needed a master locksmith, not the one who had designed the original, flawed lock. He needed his own counsel, someone sharp, unburdened by any loyalty to the O'Connell name, and possessing a keen understanding of the brutal mechanics of fiduciary law. His search led him to a minimalist office in a downtown high-rise, a space that felt more like a tech startup than a law firm. It was here he met Jessica Morales. She was a woman who seemed to operate at a higher frequency than everyone else, her mind sharp, her questions precise, her energy coiled and focused. She wasn't an old family friend who would offer condolences. She was a legal surgeon who would look at his wound, assess the damage, and tell him exactly which tools were required for the amputation. Liam laid the documents on her glass desk. The original trust, the hastily prepared amendment, and the official notification that had changed everything. He recounted the story with the dispassionate air of an engineer detailing a structural failure, focusing on the facts, not the feelings. He explained the fabricated betrayal, the exile, and the accidental weapon his family had just placed in his hands. He concluded not with a plea for help, but with a simple, direct question. "What are my legal rights and obligations?" Jessica listened intently, her fingers steepled, her eyes scanning the documents as he spoke. A slow smile, devoid of humor but full of intellectual appreciation, spread across her face. It was the smile of a grandmaster recognizing a novice's catastrophic blunder on a chessboard. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, rereading the key clauses. "Mr. O'Connell," she began, her voice crisp and clear. "Your family has made a grave and fascinating error. They have confused the roles of beneficiary and fiduciary. They took your name out of the will, but they left you in charge of the funeral." She leaned forward, the surgical analysis beginning. "As executor, you have a fiduciary duty to the trust. This is your shield. It means you are legally obligated to act in the trust's best interest, to preserve the value of its assets, and to carry out its instructions to the letter. Your instructions," she tapped the amendment, "are to ensure all assets of the O'Connell Family Trust are passed to the sole beneficiary, your brother, Ethan. The law gives you, the executor, considerable discretion in how you achieve this." Liam felt a current of anticipation. This was the heart of it. What kind of discretion? "The best kind," Jessica replied, her smile widening. "The kind that is legally bulletproof. The trust holds a diverse portfolio. A multi-million-dollar private corporation, extensive real estate holdings, stocks, a valuable art collection, vehicles. Transferring these physical assets directly can be a nightmare. There are valuation disputes, tax complications, endless legal challenges. An aggressive beneficiary could sue you for years, claiming you mismanaged the assets or undervalued them. The single most prudent, efficient, and legally defensible way to execute a trust like this is to make it simple. You remove all ambiguity." She paused for effect. "You liquidate. You convert every last painting, every stock certificate, every company truck, and every brick of every building into its most liquid and unambiguous form: cash. You sell everything at fair market value, pay the necessary taxes and fees, and then you write your brother a check. It's clean, it's final. It is the very definition of fulfilling your fiduciary duty." The words settled over Liam, and he understood. He saw the blueprint in his mind, a vision of beautiful, elegant destruction. He wasn't just being given permission to take revenge. He was being told that revenge was the most responsible and legally sound path forward. To not do it this way could, ironically, expose him to legal risk from Ethan down the line. His family had built a fortress and handed him the demolition codes. "They don't want cash," Liam stated, the gears already turning. "My father's legacy isn't the money, it's the company name on the side of a skyscraper. My mother's pride is in the family estate. My brother wants the power, the title of CEO." "Exactly," Jessica confirmed. "They want the symbols. But the trust, as amended by their own hands, doesn't entitle the beneficiary to symbols. It entitles him to the value of the assets. And you, as executor, get to determine the most prudent way to deliver that value. They gave you a scalpel, and you are legally obligated to use it to perform a precise operation. It's not your fault if the patient doesn't like the scar." The plan began to form, not as a chaotic act of rage, but as a meticulously sequenced architectural project. Liam, the builder, would now become the unbuilder. The blueprint for revenge was drawn. Phase 1 would be the assumption of control. As executor, he had the legal right to seize control of all trust assets. He would have the locks changed on the corporate offices. He would take possession of all financial accounts, freezing his parents and brother out completely. He was no longer the exile, he was the new landlord. Phase 2 was appraisal. He would hire the most ruthless and reputable independent firms to audit and value every single asset, from the paper clips in the office to the mansion itself. This would create an unimpeachable paper trail, a fortress of documentation that would shield him from any legal assault. Phase 3 was the great dismantling, liquidation. They would systematically sell everything. They wouldn't start with the company. They would start with something smaller, something deeply sentimental, to signal that the storm had made landfall. Then, piece by piece, they would auction off the empire. Phase 4 was the final, devastating delivery. After the auctions were complete, after the armies of accountants and lawyers had taken their fees, after the government had taken its massive cut of capital gains taxes, the remaining sum would be wired to Ethan O'Connell. He would be fabulously, uselessly wealthy, a king with a mountain of gold and no kingdom to rule. Liam left Jessica's office feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in nearly a year. The burning, directionless anger had been forged into something cold, hard, and purposeful. He was no longer a victim reacting to a wound. He was an architect with a new project. His family had written a flawed design brief, and he, as the master builder, would simply execute it flawlessly, regardless of the consequences. The pain was still there, a deep, foundational crack in his soul, but it was now a source of fuel, not paralysis. He would build their son the future they designed for him, brick by painful brick. The first move in Liam's campaign was not a declaration of war, but a quiet, suffocating seizure of territory. It began with a series of legally unimpeachable letters, dispatched with the sterile efficiency of a surgeon's tools. One went to the primary bank, holding the O'Connell family and corporate accounts, informing them of a change in fiduciary control and immediately freezing all access for Richard, Eleanor, and Ethan. Another went to the company's board of directors, a formal notification that the executor of the primary shareholder trust was now exercising temporary oversight. Locksmiths, polite and silent, arrived at the executive wing of O'Connell and Sons to change the locks on the doors to Richard's and Ethan's offices. The war began not with a shout, but with the soft, humiliating click of a credit card being declined at a high-end restaurant where Ethan was trying to entertain a client, and the cold, baffling conversation Richard had with his bank manager, who could only repeat the phrase, "I'm sorry, Mr. O'Connell, but my hands are tied." Their initial confusion quickly curdled into incandescent rage, but before they could even formulate a response, the first official salvo landed. Liam chose his target with the precision of an architect, identifying a structure's most significant, yet least supported, decorative element. He did not go for the company or the house. He went for his father's pride, a collection of American and European classic cars housed in a climate-controlled, museum-like garage on the family estate. This was not merely an asset, it was Richard O'Connell's personal mythology cast in steel and chrome. There was the 1961 Jaguar E-Type, a machine of impossible grace that Richard claimed was the most beautiful car ever made. There was the 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429, a barely tamed beast of raw muscle that represented his own aggressive ascent in the business world. And his favorite, a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, the exact model he had dreamed of owning as a poor kid staring through dealership windows. Each car was a chapter in the story he told himself and the world about who he was. The notification arrived via certified mail, a cold, multi-page document that felt alien in their richly appointed mailbox. It formally stated that, in accordance with the executor's duty to prudently manage and liquidate non-liquid trust assets to maximize value for the sole beneficiary, the entire O'Connell automotive collection would be professionally appraised, transported, and consigned for sale at the upcoming Barrett-Jackson Classic Car Auction. The phone call came less than an hour later. Liam was in his small apartment, reviewing blueprints for the community library, when his phone lit up with his father's name. He let it ring 3 times before answering, a small, deliberate act of control. "Hello, Father." The voice on the other end was a low growl, vibrating with a fury that had built empires and crushed competitors. "You stop this. You stop this right now. Do you hear me, Liam? Those are my cars. You have no right." "Actually, I have the sole legal right and the fiduciary obligation," Liam replied, his voice perfectly calm, devoid of any emotion. He might as well have been discussing the tensile strength of steel. "The collection is an asset of the trust. My duty is to the trust." "Duty?" Richard roared. "You're talking to me about duty after what you did?" "I am referring to my legal responsibilities as executor," Liam said, the title a shield and a sword. "I cannot allow valuable assets to sit and depreciate when they can be converted into liquid capital for the benefit of the trust's heir." Suddenly, Ethan's voice cut in, slick and urgent, clearly on speakerphone. "Liam, listen. It's me. Think about what you're doing. This is hurting Dad. We can talk about this. There's no need for lawyers and official letters. Just stop. Let's be a family again." The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost breathtaking. Liam felt a flicker of the old, hot anger, but he smothered it with the cold weight of his new purpose. "There is no family in these proceedings, Ethan. There is an executor, and there is a beneficiary. I am acting to protect your future inheritance. You should be thanking me. This process ensures you receive the maximum possible monetary value from the estate." He could hear Ethan sputtering, at a loss for words for perhaps the first time in his life. The smooth charm was useless against this wall of detached procedure. Richard got back on the line, his tone shifting from rage to a strained, threatening baritone. "I built that company from nothing. I built that life you had. I can take it all away." "You already did," Liam said, the words falling like ice chips into the silence. "You gave me nothing. But you also gave me this job. I am simply doing the job you gave me. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to coordinate with the transport company. They'll be there on Friday to collect the assets." He hung up the phone before his father could respond. The click of the disconnection echoing the sound of the locks being changed on their lives. He knew the conversation had been devastating for them, not because of what he'd said, but because of what he hadn't. He hadn't yelled, hadn't pleaded, hadn't negotiated. He had been transformed from their son into an impersonal, implacable force of bureaucracy, a machine of their own creation. The day the transport trucks arrived was, by all accounts, a grim affair. Liam was not there to see it, but he heard about it later from one of the auction house contacts. Richard and Eleanor stood on the veranda of their mansion, watching as the gleaming, perfect symbols of their success were carefully loaded onto flatbed trucks by men in white gloves. They watched as the Bel Air, Richard's American dream, was shrouded in a canvas cover and driven away. They watched as the Jaguar, Eleanor's favorite for Sunday drives, disappeared down the long, winding driveway. It was a funeral procession for their pride. 2 weeks later, Liam sat at his small kitchen table and watched the auction live on his laptop. He saw his father's Mustang roll onto the auction block under the bright, unforgiving lights. He listened as the auctioneer breathlessly recounted its history, a history intertwined with the O'Connell name. He watched as the bidding climbed, higher and higher, a frantic, impersonal dance of numbers. When the gavel finally fell, a wave of notifications began to hit his email inbox. A receipt for the Mustang, a receipt for the Bel Air, a receipt for the Jaguar. Each email was a cold, numerical confirmation of a piece of his father's soul being converted into currency. The first demolition was complete. It had not brought him joy, but a grim, quiet satisfaction. It was the feeling an architect gets when a flawed and unstable structure is brought down safely and efficiently, clearing the ground for whatever is to come next. He had sent his message. He was not negotiating. He was not bluffing. He was simply executing the plan, piece by painful piece. The official report on the automotive auction arrived at the O'Connell estate like a guest at a funeral dinner. It was delivered by a courier who required Richard's signature, a small, formal indignity that underscored their loss of control. The document itself was a testament to Liam's chilling efficiency. It detailed the auction prices for each vehicle, the auction house's commission, and the final net proceeds, a sum well into the seven figures. For a brief moment, a flicker of avarice lit up Ethan's eyes as he looked at the number, but his relief was short-lived. Attached to the financial summary was a second document, this one prepared by Jessica Morales' office. It was a preliminary, non-binding estimate of the tax implications for the beneficiary. It detailed, in cold, hard percentages, the projected capital gains tax and the subsequent income tax that would be levied upon the final cash distribution. Suddenly, the impressive number from the auction was slashed by nearly half. The reality of Liam's strategy crashed down upon Ethan with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a simple transfer of wealth. This was a conversion, and a costly one. He exploded, the carefully constructed facade of the grieving son shattering into 1,000 pieces of raw, undiluted greed. "Look at this," he yelled, waving the paper in his father's face. The raw panic in his voice made him sound like a petulant child. "He's letting the government take millions. Millions. Why didn't he just transfer the titles to me? We could have kept them, or I could have sold them privately. This is incompetence. He's destroying my inheritance." Richard stared at his son, his face a stony mask, but for the first time, a flicker of doubt, of profound disappointment, entered his eyes. He had lost a piece of his history, a collection that represented decades of his life's triumphs. He was grieving the loss of symbols, of his legacy, and his chosen heir, the son for whom he had sacrificed everything, was not grieving with him. He was screaming about tax efficiencies. Eleanor, who had been watching in horrified silence, finally spoke, her voice thin and reedy. "Ethan, your father lost something that meant the world to him, and I'm losing millions of dollars." Ethan shot back, his desperation making him reckless. What's the point of inheriting a fortune if he just gives half of it away to the IRS before I even see it? It was in that ugly, unguarded moment that the first real crack appeared in their family's united front. Richard and Eleanor looked at their golden child and saw, for the first time, the grasping, desperate man beneath the charm. They saw that he had no reverence for the legacy, only a ravenous appetite for the cash. He was not the responsible successor he had pretended to be. He was a lottery winner, furious that the jackpot was smaller than advertised. Realizing he had lost the support of his parents, and seeing his grand inheritance being methodically whittled down by taxes and fees, Ethan descended into a state of pure panic. He decided he had to confront Liam himself, face to face. He ambushed him one evening, waiting in the shadows of the nondescript lobby of Liam's apartment building. When Liam walked in, weary from a long day at work, Ethan stepped out in front of him. "We need to talk," Ethan said, trying to muster his old, confident swagger. Liam simply looked at him, his expression unreadable. "There's nothing to talk about. All communication should go through my lawyer." "Stop it with the lawyer crap, Liam," Ethan hissed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Come on, it's me. We're brothers. You've made your point. You're angry. I get it. But this has to stop. You're burning the whole thing to the ground. "I'm not burning anything," Liam replied, his voice level and calm. "I am executing our parents' wishes as outlined in a legally binding document. You're liquidating everything. The taxes are killing us. Just stop the sales. We can work something out. You can be the COO, I'll be the CEO, just like it should have been." The offer was pathetic, a desperate gambit from a man who knew he was losing. Liam almost laughed. The time for working something out ended in that law office a year ago. "You have no position to offer, Ethan. You don't own the company. The trust does, and I control the trust." Ethan's face contorted in a snarl of frustration. The charm had failed. He switched to threats. "I'll sue you. I will. I'll take you to court, and I'll tell the judge that you're an incompetent executor, that you're deliberately destroying the estate's value out of spite." "Please, feel free," Liam said, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Jessica would love that. She's already prepared for it. We have 3 independent financial advisors who have testified that liquidation is the most prudent and legally secure method of execution. A lawsuit will only delay your inheritance and rack up hundreds of thousands in legal fees, which, as the trust's sole expense, will be deducted from your final payout. So by all means, sue me. It only costs you." Ethan was deflated, his threats turning to dust in his mouth. He was trapped. In a final, desperate plea, his voice cracked. "Why are you doing this, Liam? You're ruining me." Liam took a step closer, his voice dropping so only Ethan could hear. "You seem to be confused. I am not doing anything to you. I am a legal instrument, an architect executing a blueprint. Your name is on that blueprint as the client. This is the house you designed. You and mother and father. Now you just have to live in it." Liam pushed past him and walked to the elevator, leaving Ethan standing alone in the lobby, a king whose crown was melting before his eyes. With Ethan's failure, the parents' desperation grew. They began to call Liam, their tones shifting from anger to pleading. Richard left a rambling, whiskey-fueled voicemail talking about the old days, about building the company, his voice thick with a confusing mixture of pride and regret. Eleanor's messages were more direct, tearful appeals to the son she now missed, begging him to stop, to remember that she was his mother. Liam listened to none of them. He had instructed Sarah to delete any voicemails from their numbers. The son they were appealing to was a ghost. Finally, Eleanor made a last, desperate attempt. She showed up at his apartment, knocking on the door, her voice calling his name, muffled by the wood. "Liam? Please. Honey. It's Mom. Let's just talk. Please." Inside, Liam and Sarah stood in silence, not moving, until the knocking finally stopped and they heard her defeated footsteps retreating down the hall. 2 hours later, a courier delivered a letter to the O'Connell estate. It was from Jessica's firm, addressed to Eleanor. "It has come to our attention that you have attempted to make direct contact with our client. Please be advised that all communication regarding the O'Connell Family Trust must be directed to this office. Any further unsolicited contact with Mr. O'Connell will be documented and may be considered harassment." It was the final brick in the wall. The son was gone, replaced by our client. The family home had become a gilded prison, and its wardens, Richard and Eleanor, were left with nothing but their powerlessness, the company of their greedy, panicked son, and the terrifying, silent hum of the demolition machine they themselves had switched on. The cracks in the facade were no longer visible. The entire structure was beginning to crumble. The liquidation of the art and stock portfolios followed the sale of the cars, each transaction a quiet, orderly step in the methodical dismantling of the O'Connell dynasty. With the liquid assets accounted for, the time came to address the heart of the empire, O'Connell and Sons itself. In order to prepare the company for sale, a full and comprehensive audit was not just a strategic choice, it was a legal necessity. For the first time in over a year, Liam walked through the glass doors of the headquarters. He was not the exiled son returning in shame, but the executor, a figure of immense and unnerving authority. Employees who had once averted their gazes now stared with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He did not go to his old architect's office, a space filled with the ghosts of his passion. Instead, he installed himself and the team of forensic accountants he'd hired through Jessica's firm in the main boardroom, the very room where his father had hosted triumphs and Ethan had spun his webs of charm. It became their command center. The process was meticulous, a slow and careful excavation of a decade's worth of digital and paper records. They weren't just looking at the numbers, they were examining the story the numbers told. At first, their focus was on the original accusation, the $7 million hole that had been the catalyst for Liam's ruin. It didn't take the seasoned accountants long to unravel Ethan's clumsy fabrication. The invoices from the German supplier were easily proven to be forgeries. The wire transfers for Apex Innovations were traced to a series of shell corporations that evaporated into thin air in the Cayman Islands. The entire narrative, which his family had accepted as gospel, was exposed as a work of amateur fiction under the harsh, fluorescent lights of the audit. Liam felt a grim, hollow satisfaction as he read the preliminary report. This was the proof, the black and white validation that he had known in his gut all along. But this discovery, as significant as it was merely the loose thread. And as Liam and his team began to pull on it, the entire tapestry of Ethan's life began to unravel, revealing a pattern of deceit and decay far more rotten than Liam could have ever imagined. The accountants, trained to spot anomalies, started flagging Ethan's expense reports. They were a monument to narcissism and fraud. There were $5,000 client dinners in Miami on weekends, when the company had no active projects in Florida. There were first-class flights to Las Vegas, coded as attending construction trade shows that had never taken place. There were purchases from high-end jewelers and luxury clothing brands, laughably disguised as employee gifts and corporate branding. It was a breathtaking portrait of a man who viewed the company as his personal slush fund. But the rot went deeper than just lavish spending. As they dug into the company's liabilities, they discovered a series of short-term, high-interest business loans that had been taken out over the past 3 years. These loans, amounting to millions of dollars, were not on the official ledgers that were presented to Richard. They had been secured using company assets as collateral, and the loan documents bore Ethan's signature. The funds hadn't been reinvested into the company. They had been wired directly to personal accounts, to casinos, to clear personal credit card debts. Ethan hadn't just been stealing the profits, he had been mortgaging the company's future to fund his secret life. The team uncovered a hidden gambling addiction, with casino markers from Atlantic City and a history of significant losses with offshore sports betting sites. They found payments for a luxury apartment in another city, the residence of a mistress who was also on the company payroll as a marketing consultant. He had vanity projects, disastrous investments in a nightclub, and a friend's tech startup, all secretly bankrolled with money siphoned from the budgets of legitimate construction projects. This explained the recent decline in profit margins that Ethan had blamed on market fluctuations and union troubles. He had been cutting corners on materials and labor to cover the holes his schemes were creating, jeopardizing not just the company's finances, but its hard-won reputation for quality. The final, devastating truth came in a thick, 300-page report that the lead accountant placed on the boardroom table in front of Liam. The conclusion was stark and stripped of all emotion. O'Connell & Sons was a ship taking on water, and Ethan had been the one drilling holes in the hull all along. The company was dangerously over-leveraged, suffocating under the weight of Ethan's secret debts. Their analysis concluded that, had the trust not been activated, had Ethan been allowed to continue his reckless course, O'Connell & Sons would have faced catastrophic financial failure and likely bankruptcy within 18 months. Liam sat alone in the vast, silent boardroom as night fell over the city, the lights of the Hawthorne Tower, his tower twinkling in the distance. He read the report from cover to cover. The scale of the betrayal was almost incomprehensible. Ethan hadn't just lied to steal a company, he had lied to gain control of a sinking ship he himself had scuttled. He had planned to use the family's remaining personal wealth, their real estate, their stocks, the assets, Liam was now liquidating as a last-ditch bailout for the mess he had created. His act of framing Liam wasn't just an opportunistic power grab, it was an act of profound, desperate self-preservation. There was no rage left in Liam. There was no shock. There was only the cold, absolute certainty of a man who finally understands the true nature of the ground beneath his feet. The revenge he had planned, the meticulous, legal dismantling of his family's empire, was no longer just an act of personal justice. It was a mercy killing. He wasn't demolishing a beloved family home out of spite. He was razing a condemned structure, a building whose foundations had been rotted through from the inside before it could collapse and destroy everything and everyone around it. He now held the ultimate weapon, the undeniable, documented, absolute truth, and he knew exactly what he had to do with it. Liam held the finished report in his hands. It was a hefty, 300-page document, professionally bound in dark blue leather, with the title embossed in simple gold lettering. Executor's Fiduciary Report on the Financial State of the O'Connell Family Trust. It was not a letter from a son. It was not a plea for an apology. It was a weapon of pure, unassailable fact. He had spent weeks with Jessica and the forensic accountants, compiling every piece of evidence into a cold, logical narrative. The report contained no emotional language, no accusations, no hint of the personal betrayal that fueled its creation. It was simply a clinical dissection of a diseased corporation. It had sections detailing Ethan's forged invoices, his fraudulent expense reports, the secret high-interest loans, and the multi-million-dollar transfers to casinos and offshore accounts. It included copies of bank statements, signed loan agreements, and sworn affidavits from the accountants. It concluded with a final, devastating summary of the company's true financial health, projecting insolvency within 2 years. Liam knew that simply telling his parents the truth would be useless. Their belief system was too entrenched, their denial too powerful. They would see it as another lie, a desperate attempt by their disgraced son to smear their golden child. He couldn't just tell them. He had to show them. He had to present them with a document so thorough, so professional, and so overwhelmingly factual that their defenses would have no choice but to crumble. The delivery was scheduled with the same precision as the rest of his plan. On a crisp autumn afternoon, a professional legal courier, a man with a severe expression and an immaculate suit, arrived at the gates of the O'Connell estate. He carried a heavy briefcase containing 3 individually sealed copies of the report. The instructions were explicit. A copy was to be delivered into the hands of Richard O'Connell, Eleanor O'Connell, and Ethan O'Connell, and each was required to sign a document confirming receipt. The scene was set in the Grand Family Library, the very room where Liam had been cast out. An unspoken tension had summoned them there, a feeling that some final judgment was at hand. When the butler announced the courier, they were confused. When the 3 identical heavy reports were placed before them on the polished mahogany table, their confusion turned to apprehension. Ethan picked his up, his face paling slightly as he read the title. He started to bluster. "What is this?" More legal nonsense from Liam's. But his voice trailed off as he opened to the first page and saw the detailed forensic analysis of the Apex Innovations lie. Richard opened his copy with a scowl, expecting another procedural notice. But his eyes snagged on a name in the table of contents: undisclosed liabilities. He turned to that section, and the blood drained from his face as he saw copies of loan agreements against company assets, signed not by him, but by Ethan. Eleanor, ever concerned with appearances, flipped through the pages until she landed on the appendix for irregular expense reimbursements. She saw the credit card statements, the 5-star hotel bills from cities where they had no business, the receipts from a jeweler in New York for a diamond necklace she had never received. For the next hour, the only sound in that magnificent library was the soft rustle of turning pages. It was the sound of a world ending. Liam had orchestrated it perfectly. By presenting the information in this cold, formal manner, he had removed himself from the equation. They were not arguing with their son, they were confronting a mountain of irrefutable data. Richard's hands began to shake as he read about the mortgaged assets, the very properties he had worked 70-hour weeks to acquire, leveraged by his son to pay off gambling debts. The rage he had held for Liam for over a year finally guttered and died, replaced by the crushing weight of his own monumental failure. He was a master builder who had failed to see the rot in his own foundation. He had protected the termite as it devoured his house from the inside out. Eleanor let out a soft, strangled gasp. She was staring at a copy of a wire transfer to the marketing consultant, the mistress, followed by a series of intimate, incriminating emails the audit had uncovered on the company's servers. The financial ruin was one thing, but this was a social stain, an ugly, sordid secret that shattered the perfect family portrait she had dedicated her life to maintaining. Her carefully constructed world of charity galas, tasteful elegance, and familial pride collapsed into a pile of cheap, tawdry lies. Her favoritism, her willful blindness to Ethan's flaws, had not just enabled this, it had encouraged it. All eyes eventually turned to Ethan. He was sweating, his face a ghastly shade of pale. He frantically flipped through the pages, as if hoping to find a single error, a single point of entry for one of his lies. But there was none. It was all there. Every secret, every theft, every betrayal, laid bare in neat columns and verified figures. He was a butterfly pinned to a board, his every beautiful pattern revealed to be nothing more than colored dust. "It's a misunderstanding," he finally whispered, the words sounding pathetic and hollow even to his own ears. "Liam, he's twisting things. It's not what it looks like." Richard slowly closed the report, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. He looked at his son, his chosen one, and for the first time, he saw him clearly. He saw not the charming successor, but a weak, desperate fraud, a parasite. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes was one of utter, soul-crushing contempt. The truth had finally arrived, not as a cleansing fire, but as a silent, suffocating avalanche of ice. There was no screaming, no accusations. The devastation was too profound for that. There was only the thick, heavy silence of absolute ruin, a silence filled with the ghosts of what they had lost, and the horrifying knowledge that they, themselves, had been the architects of their own destruction. The three of them sat there, imprisoned in their library, with the truth lying on the table between them like a tombstone. The final act was not set in a courtroom or a law office, but in the cavernous, impersonal ballroom of a downtown Boston hotel. It was a place designed for celebrating weddings and corporate mergers, but on this day, it was a grand and gilded abattoir, where a family legacy was to be publicly slaughtered. The air was thick with the scent of money and morbid curiosity. The room was filled with the city's real estate tycoons, rival construction firms, and investment bankers, vultures in bespoke suits, gathered to pick over the carcass of the O'Connell empire. They spoke in hushed, speculative tones, their eyes darting towards the front of the room where the two prize assets were displayed on large screens. Lot A, the magnificent Chestnut Hill estate, and Lot B, the corporate headquarters and controlling interest of O'Connell and Sons. Richard and Eleanor arrived not as the king and queen of this world, but as ghosts haunting their own wake. They were seated at a small, reserved table near the back, a courtesy Liam had insisted upon, a final, cruel turn of the screw that forced them to bear witness. Richard, a man who once filled every room he entered, seemed to have shrunk. His powerful shoulders were slumped, his face a roadmap of grief and regret. Eleanor sat beside him, stick-thin and fragile, hiding behind oversized sunglasses that did nothing to conceal the profound brokenness within. They looked like two survivors of a shipwreck, washed ashore in a land they no longer recognized. Ethan was not there. His absence was a screaming confession of his cowardice, a final, damning testament to the fraud he was. He could not face the public consequences of his private sins. Liam arrived a few minutes before the auction began, entering through a side door with Jessica at his side. He wore a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, a suit that was not armor, but a uniform. He did not look at his parents. He did not scan the crowd. His focus was entirely on the auctioneer's podium at the front of the room. He took his designated seat in a roped-off section with the other legal representatives, a man at work, a functionary in the grand, terrible machine he had set in motion. The auction for the house began first. A slick, charismatic auctioneer took the stage, his voice booming through the sound system as he described the estate. He spoke of its hand-carved moldings, its storied history, its manicured lawns. Each superlative was a fresh stab of pain for Eleanor, who remembered bringing her twin boys home to that house, remembered garden parties and Christmases by the grand fireplace. Richard stared blankly at the screen, which showed a sun-drenched photograph of the home's facade, the home he had bought as the ultimate symbol that he had finally, truly made it. The bidding was swift and brutal. Strangers, represented by anonymous numbers on paddles, threw money at the screen, callously dissecting the value of his family's memories. Richard watched as the price climbed past what he'd paid, past what he thought it was worth, and into the abstract realm of pure commerce. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. His life had become a spectator sport. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel cracked like a whip, the sound echoing through the silent, cavernous room. To paddle number 78, Omnicorp Development. A developer. They would likely tear it down, Richard thought with a wave of nausea. They would tear down the walls that had held his life and replace them with a row of soulless modern boxes. His personal legacy erased. Then came the main event. Lot B. O'Connell and Sons. The auctioneer's tone shifted, becoming more serious, more momentous. He spoke of the company's 60-year history, its reputation for quality, its portfolio of landmark buildings that had shaped the Boston skyline. He was selling Richard's soul, and the room leaned forward in collective anticipation. The bidding started high and escalated quickly. This was not about sentiment. This was about market share, about assets and contracts. The names of Richard's oldest rivals were called out as they entered the fray. He was forced to sit and watch the men he had competed against his entire life try to buy his name, his work, his entire identity for pennies on the dollar. The auctioneer's voice was a hypnotic, rhythmic chant, a verbal machine gun firing off numbers. The price climbed, 8 figures, then 9. The field of bidders thinned, leaving only a few determined players. From his seat, Liam watched the proceedings with the detached focus of an engineer monitoring a controlled demolition. His face was a mask of professional neutrality. He was not a son watching his family's destruction. He was the executor, ensuring the process was transparent and the highest possible value was achieved for the beneficiary. It was his duty. The final moments were a blur of shouted numbers and frantic gestures. It came down to 2 bidders, a major national competitor and a mysterious phone bidder, represented by a woman in the front row. The price reached a staggering figure, the absolute maximum the market would bear. A hush fell over the room, going once, going twice. The auctioneer looked out over the crowd, his eyes searching for any last-minute challenge. There was none. The gavel fell. The sound was not a crack this time, but a deep, resonant boom, like a cathedral door swinging shut for the last time. It was the sound of the end. Sold, the auctioneer bellowed, a triumphant finale to the tragedy. To the phone bidder, Phoenix Legacy Holdings. The name meant nothing to Richard and Eleanor. It was just another faceless corporation, another stranger picking the last meat from the bones of their life. Richard finally broke, burying his face in his trembling hands. Eleanor sat bolt upright, frozen, a living statue of grief. The auction was over. People began to stand, the room filling with the low buzz of conversation as the story of the O'Connell auction became the city's newest piece of gossip. Across the ballroom, through the dispersing crowd, Liam's eyes met his father's for a fleeting second. Richard looked up, his face hollowed out, his eyes pleading, searching for a son he could no longer find. He found only the executor. Liam held his gaze for a moment, his expression revealing nothing. No triumph, no pity, no remorse. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, not to his father but to Jessica. His work was done. He stood, straightened his suit, and walked out of the ballroom without a backward glance, leaving his parents alone in the wreckage he had so perfectly and legally created. In the quiet, desolate aftermath of the auction, a new reality settled upon Richard and Eleanor O'Connell. Their grand life was dismantled, replaced by the sterile anonymity of a luxury condominium, a place with stunning views of a city that no longer felt like theirs. Their days were silent and heavy, punctuated only by the presence of their son Ethan, a man now hollowed out by public disgrace and private guilt. The news, when it came, was not delivered by a courier or a lawyer, but through a digital press release that appeared on a local business journal's website. Richard was aimlessly scrolling through the day's headlines on his tablet when he saw the name of his old company. The article announced that O'Connell and Sons, recently acquired by the investment group Phoenix Legacy Holdings, was emerging from a period of restructuring. It went on to name the new president and chief executive officer, the man who would be tasked with rebuilding its future, Liam O'Connell. Richard read the name 3 times, the words blurring in his vision. It was impossible, a cruel joke. He handed the tablet to Eleanor, his hand trembling. She read the article, and a soft, broken sound escaped her lips. The full, monstrous, and brilliant scope of Liam's plan was finally revealed. He hadn't just orchestrated the demolition. He had been waiting at the bottom with a dustpan and a deed, ready to claim the salvageable pieces for himself. He had used their own blind rage to force a sale, driving the company's perceived value down, scaring away all but the most daring investors. He had then stepped in and purchased his own birthright for a fraction of its true worth, not with their money, but with his own. His reputation for integrity and quiet genius, the very qualities they had overlooked and devalued his entire life, had been his true currency, allowing him to secure the backing he needed from investors who recognized real value when they saw it. He had not destroyed the legacy, he had seized it. Driven by a final, desperate sliver of hope that they could appeal to the son they had wronged, Richard and Eleanor went to the headquarters of the company that was no longer theirs. The receptionist, a new face, regarded them with polite confusion. When Liam finally agreed to see them, he did not receive them in their father's old, palatial office. He had them shown to his former workspace, the large, open-plan studio of the architecture and design department. He was standing over a massive drafting table, a pencil in his hand, surrounded by blueprints and scale models. He was not dressed as a CEO, but as what he had always been, a builder. They stood before him, 2 diminished figures, their pride and anger long since burned away, leaving only the ashes of regret. "Liam," Richard began, his voice raspy. "We saw the news. We didn't understand. We are so sorry," Eleanor whispered, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her face. "Ethan, he fooled us. We were blind. We were fools. But you're our son. Please, can we fix this?" Liam looked up from his work, his eyes holding no warmth, only a profound and weary finality. "There is nothing to fix," he said, his voice calm and even. "The structure was condemned. I simply brought it down." He gestured around the room, at the young, focused architects at their workstations. "You are mistaken. You don't have a son here. You have the man who bought your company." He explained it to them then, not with anger, but with the cold precision of a final report. He told them how his small savings, combined with the trust and backing of investors who valued competence over a name, had been enough. "You thought my inheritance was something you could write on a piece of paper," he said, looking directly at his father. "You were wrong. My real inheritance was the reputation I built every time I solved an impossible problem, every time I delivered a project on time and under budget. It was the one thing you couldn't take from me, because you never even knew I had it." He turned his gaze to his mother. "You wanted a son who shone in the spotlight, but you never understood that the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. You were so busy applauding the performance, you never once bothered to look at the blueprints." He straightened up, laying his pencil down on the drafting table. "You come here asking for a son, but that son died a year ago in a lawyer's office. You're looking at his executor. My job is done. The beneficiary, Ethan, will soon receive his inheritance. A mountain of cash, which I'm sure he will squander. He is your legacy now. You must live with that." He walked them to the door of the studio. "This company isn't O'Connell and Sons. That name is retired, buried with the past. This is Phoenix Legacy. We build things that are meant to last, on foundations that are solid and true, something you both forgot how to do." He opened the door for them. "Goodbye, Richard. Goodbye, Eleanor." He used their names, a final, formal act of severance. As they walked away, 2 broken ghosts in a building that was once their palace, the door closed behind them, and Liam returned to his work, to the clean lines and the quiet, honest logic of the blueprint spread before him. Never underestimate the quiet precision of a person who has been pushed too far. For when they finally act, they do so not with the messy heat of passion, but with the cold, unforgiving clarity of a perfectly executed plan. Justice, sometimes, is not found in a gavel's loud crack, but in the silent, meticulous details of the paperwork. Liam O'Connell found his justice, built on the ashes of the family who betrayed him. But not every story of betrayal finds such a clear and final resolution. Join us next time for another story from the heart of the family, where the deepest wounds are always inflicted by the ones we are supposed to trust the most.